Bilateral trade between China and the U.S. amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars annually. This trade supports millions of jobs, influencing everything from electronics to pharmaceuticals. Yukon Huang is an economist who has worked both in China and the U.S. Huang is a senior fellow and research associate in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment. He's the former World Bank China Country Director. His areas of research include China's economic and political development and its impact in Asia and globally. I met Huang at our offices here in Washington, D.C. So, Yukon, how do you see economic relations between these two countries evolving over the next couple of years?
Well, sometimes I try to use the word cautious. The cautious is actually a fairly optimistic term. And I would say about half of it is caused by what I call economic change, China's growth, becoming a significant economic power. Many people refer to this as the Thucydides trap. Emerging China, challenging the U.S.'s dominance, creates resentment. On top of that, this rise, unprecedented historically, because it occurs in 2 or 3, 4 decades, not over 100 years. It's very hard for both sides to adjust. They don't have the institutions. Institutions take time to build up. So how do you deal with these tensions? You don't have the means, the experience, the institutions that can deal with these new challenges. And you have another complicated factor that you essentially have one world but two systems, two political economic systems, the U.S. and China. They're quite different. And that aggravates the situation. That difference in political economic systems in terms of tensions didn't matter when China was a poor country. People weren't concerned about that. The fact that your system is different, so what? I don't see you as a threat economically, politically, technologically, but a more powerful China, a richer China, economically stronger China, combined with a different political economic system, you have an issue, you have a problem. And today I see that kind of a problem between U.S. and China. We have a concept in economics, in game theory, called the prisoner's dilemma. You have two protagonists. They're both powerful. They both believe very strongly in their own objectives and aspirations. You have what I call tit-for-tat policies. You do something, I retaliate. You do something, I retaliate. And they both continue this process. The consequence is both sides are worse off. Okay? They don't get any better. So in game theory, when you have this situation, how do you solve this? Okay, there is two options that occur. One is that one side suddenly realizes that this process is not going anywhere, that both sides are doing and getting worse off, and they change the whole nature of the game by proposing something quite different. And I think there is actually a concept out there. Xi Jinping actually mentioned it 15 years ago, a new type of great power relations, but no one defined what that meant, okay? And there's another option in terms of trying to turn around the situation, the intervention of a third party, because these two giants cannot solve it. Now, normally, in my view, globally, that would have been Europe. Europe would have come in and basically say, this doesn't serve global interests, we're all suffering. Europe is not involved in great power rivalries, okay? Europe is more integrated economically with China, much more than the U.S. is. Germany exports a large chunk of its money, products, via China, okay? Germany needs more technology, and it sees that it cannot catch up with the United States in many areas. It potentially can partner with China.
Trade between China and Europe has seen significant growth over the years. China places a strong emphasis on expanding high-technology trade with Europe. Chinese companies are increasingly involved in sectors like telecommunications, green energy, and electric vehicles.
So why didn't Europe step up? One thing is, Europe's currently politically uncertain, unstable situations. New Chancellor of Germany. Macron is under attack. Italy has moved in a different direction. UK has a political change. The major economic powers in Italy are going through transition. There's no unified voice in Europe. But if they had a unified voice, they could potentially say, look, this rivalry between the U.S. and China is serving no useful purpose. We are caught in the middle. We're being torn in a way. We cannot afford, in fact, to turn our backs to Asia or China. We already have this problem with Russia. How can we cut off Russia and cut off the rest of Asia? We can't survive that way. Europe has very strong interest to say, we've got to find a middle ground. We've got to integrate China. We've got to find a better collaboration. And there is ways. For example, Europe, companies like Siemens, Nokia, they could partner with China on 5G communication systems. There is a trust element. So 5G is being banned in the United States. It's also being banned in Europe. But you can think of a situation where China, Huawei, partners with Nokia or Siemens to supply a 5G communication system in a European country, with the European company taking care of the risks, China supplying the hardware and all those aspects in which it's very, very good at, and everyone would be better off. Green technology is the same thing, and that's actually happening. There's this big debate in Europe about tariffs on Chinese products, but unlike the tariffs on the U.S. side, Europe's structure or intention is to encourage Chinese producers to come into Europe and produce in Europe, whereas America just wants to keep Chinese companies out. So the solution actually is for Chinese companies to go into Europe, to partner with European companies, to serve both the European companies and the world, and to share the technology. Those kinds of examples could provide a middle ground, which actually would make it very difficult for the U.S. to continue what I call this very negative perception in terms of working with China on trade and technology.
China's growing middle class represents a significant market for U.S. goods and services, creating opportunities for American companies to expand their sales in China. Biden's kept a lot of those tariffs in place. I think perhaps to your point, the perceptions being what they are, it probably would not behoove him politically to make any kind of changes, so he's kind of stuck. But do you see us as kind of mired that this is the way it's going to be for some time, or?
Not unless you have a dramatic change in perceptions. What does Biden and Trump have in common in terms of this kind of a trade, technology, China? They both have this kind of perception that the trade technology relations with China is a zero-sum game. They both have this kind of a middle-class focus, loss of jobs issue, and blaming China. And I think it's a very difficult issue to deal with, but to get around it, you have to have leaders who actually understand and will be willing courageously to discuss with the American public exactly what is the problem and the nature of the problem. For example, Biden and Trump, they both are pushing manufacturing jobs in the Midwest as a solution for generating more job opportunities and higher incomes in the U.S. Only 9% of the jobs in America are in manufacturing. 89% are in services, 2% in agriculture. Okay, the key to higher incomes in the U.S. is better paid, more productive services, not manufacturing. Even if you are totally successful in generating more manufacturing jobs, you may only generate 1 or 2% more jobs, and those jobs are not high paying. Okay? There is this view again, and Biden also talks about tariffs. He's kept the tariffs in place, and Trump is talking about increasing the tariffs. We've gone through 4 or 5 years of 25% higher tariffs on Chinese goods. True, the share of Chinese products coming into the United States has declined relative to any other countries, but China's share of global exports have actually increased to record highs. So what gives? It's not exporting as much to the U.S., it's exporting more to other nations, South Asia, Latin America, Africa, Europe, even Europe, Middle East. And those increases more than compensate for the losses to U.S. And many of those exports going to other countries or parts and components are being used to make products which are then re-exported to the U.S. So economists have shown actually that after the tariffs, directly and indirectly, the share of products coming from China into America has actually increased. The dependency has actually gotten higher. But nevertheless, politicians are going around saying the only way we can reduce dependency is to have higher tariffs.
Well, it's so funny because the pivot to Asia, it's almost been the pivot from Asia. China's figured a workaround in many respects.
It's a workaround. But here's the issue about that workaround. That workaround also has resulted in a major problem for the U.S., which is frontal in the political debate in America today, inflation. People are saying, well, you're telling me that inflation is moderated. If that's the case, why haven't prices come down? They may not be going up as rapidly as they were last year, but they don't come down. And the answer is very, very simple. A large impact of the change in the trade relations, the fact that products coming into the U.S. have to go indirectly to other countries, results in higher transport costs, more logistical issues, higher cost structures. So those products' prices may not be going up anymore, but they're now permanently at a higher level. So everyone in the U.S. is saying, well, I don't understand it. We have high interest rates. We've done everything. Inflation may be stabilizing, but we don't have lower prices. And the answer is they're now fixed at a fundamentally higher level because our supply chains are now different. And they basically end up with a product cost structure to America, which is permanently higher than they used to be.
Chinese companies have been increasingly investing in the U.S., acquiring American businesses and establishing operations, which enhances economic ties. China is deeply integrated into the global supply chain, with many U.S. companies relying on Chinese components and materials for their products. Let me ask about global supply chains, because one of the things we've heard so much about decoupling and you've heard some businesses saying, well, maybe we can move outside of China somewhere else. What's been the overall outcome there?
Well, I would say supply chains are more resilient and more cost-driven than we would ever expect. We can basically say that we need to produce this here or it should be there, but companies make those decisions, not governments. And if there's some kind of a force to do so, people find ways around it. Okay, so a lot of these parts and components and green technologies, even solar cells, which used to be produced in China, export directly to the U.S., and because of tariffs are no longer viable, and now they're being produced in Vietnam, but largely from Chinese components. Suppose you started to ban that, and you would say, Vietnam, I ban you, or somehow I'm going to make sure that you don't import those components from China. Vietnam can't produce those components. It could try, but probably a 3 or 4 time cost structure. So ultimately that product would come into the U.S. not at, let's say, 20% more because they had to go via Vietnam, but 3 or 4 times more. That serves nobody's purpose, okay? And then companies would not be able to survive. You're going to have the same issue here in the U.S. about the advanced chips. We're going to be producing advanced chips here in the U.S. based upon processes and techniques that exist in Taiwan, okay? But the Taiwan cost structure, labor-wise, is about 1/3 as cheap, okay? And we don't have the skills of the people, the engineering. Then you're going to have to put up a barrier saying, American companies, you can't buy these chips from Taiwan anymore. You have to buy it locally, and now you have to pay twice as high. This is where it all breaks down. We don't explain that, actually. We only say we're going to be generating high-quality jobs and we'll be able to generate domestically. So this is where I think leadership is an issue. It's very easy to pander to concerns about security or loss of jobs. And think about it. We don't really have an unemployment problem in the U.S. now. We can't find enough workers in many areas. And in these high-tech areas, we can't even find any workers either. So why are we concerned about losing high-tech jobs when we can't find any people who want to work in these jobs? But that is, to me, the leadership problem. And it's much easier to say, well, they're a problem. I'm going to put a tariff on them. I'm going to sanction. So I think the key issue here in a globalized world, you have to have leaders who basically have the courage and strength to stand up to the American public and still win elections based upon, and this is tough.
The path forward in terms of bringing these two sides together, I mean, the point that you illustrated, if there was a intermediary that could kind of negotiate this, that would be great. There's been a lot of talk about, look, maybe there are areas where both sides can come together and work on things. Of course, climate change is one of those. Do you see that as a possible outcome?
Even a year or two ago, people would have said, and I would have said, that's the most likely area to try to build up a collaborative relationship. But look what's happened over the last 6, 7, 8 months. You're going to ban all these Chinese green technologies. You're going to discourage Chinese battery makers from investing in the United States producing batteries, which are needed. That technology does not exist here. How can you deal with climate change issues if you're not going to collaborate on the technology and the production facilities which would make it better? And now you're going to up tariffs. So what I thought was the most fruitful area has actually been caught again in this kind of security manufacturing emotional concerns that this is not working to the U.S. advantages. And this is why I've become relatively pessimistic, because even in the area where there's likely to be the most benefits, climate change, green technologies, solar cells, electric vehicles, environmental benefits are large. Our textbooks say they should be subsidized. We now complain that China's subsidizing these, okay? But we know that climate change, green technology need to be subsidized to be economically viable because the costs are not recognized, the pollution costs, everything else. So these kinds of product lines should be subsidized. Now we complain that they are being subsidized. Okay.
Right, but I think people who look at it and measure it the way you did say, wait, it's kind of it's very similar, it's just different.
Similar but different. And we have different assumptions. But that creates biases. It's very easy for us here in the U.S. to say, that's unfair. And then I say, well, look, that's a different system. That's the only way they can handle it. Okay. And the same thing is for state enterprises. Where do the state enterprises get most of the funding? Actually, it's from retained earnings. They generate a lot of profits, and they don't pay dividends. American companies, when they generate a lot, pay dividends. A lot. And that goes to households and others. In China, the company uses it. And that's their system.
Yeah. It's fascinating always talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Take care.